Hey y'all, I'm Robi. Y'all know me from the Voodoo video with Free Tours by Foot, and I'm with Andrew today. And today our journey is going to take you through the Treme, the very first Black African American neighborhood. You're going to hear a whole lot about food, you're going to hear about culture. I get to show y'all what my family was. I get to show y'all a bunch of personal stuff that you don't get to see online. We're going to give that all to you right here.
Yeah, we're gonna see a lot of different spots connected with this. I guess for starters, we're right on the edge of the French Quarter now. So the French Quarter is adjacent to the Treme, and in the distance, actually, you can see from where we are, St. Louis Cathedral and Jackson Square. So a lot of the stuff that tourists give their main attention to is really only a stone's throw away from all of this. But once you get out here, you're in a whole different part of history that really flies under the radar when you're in the French Quarter. So what we're gonna see is gonna begin with Armstrong Park, the park that's right here next to us. This is dedicated to various pieces of music history, and it contains a spot that really draws the connection between New Orleans and West Africa. And then we're gonna get outside the park, on the way see some music venues, and then we'll see a church that is one of the big community hubs for the Treme. We'll pass by a few different museums that you can check out if you come to visit. That's gonna include the Backstreet Cultural Museum, which gets into masking practices and parade traditions. We're also gonna see the Treme Petite Jazz Museum, which goes into the history of jazz music, very important here. And we will see a restaurant that we can strongly recommend to you, some real classic New Orleans houses, and then we'll finish with a kind of community gathering place turned highway overpass turned community gathering place again. So, a lot of stuff in the next little while. And for y'all who haven't heard of the Treme before, the way people have a connection into it is either you sometimes just glimpse it from a distance, and for some people, the main reference is the TV show Treme that HBO made, which goes real heavy on the music aspect. And then some people have like a really personal connection with it, even if they're not from New Orleans. And that's why, even though I've led a lot of these on my own, we wanted to make sure Robi was along because he's got the first-hand expertise.
And a family tie. Yes. And all three of us is from Louisiana, like all of us from Louisiana. And even where we come from in mid to southern Louisiana, a lot of people don't know that still live there. They don't know that the Treme is the very first Black African-American neighborhood, and also, most importantly, the birthplace of jazz. And the most important thing about it being the birthplace of jazz, a lot of the music y'all listen to today, some music that you don't even realize is connected to jazz, all that started right here, baby.
Yeah.
And we're gonna introduce y'all to that.
We're gonna get into some different names in music. Also, when Robi says all three of us, he is including both of us and who are childhood friends. And the cameraman James.
Yeah, what y'all don't know is all three of us grew up together. We've been together since we were like in elementary and high school, middle school too. So y'all get the authentic experience of true Louisiana people showing y'all like where we come from.
So since you've got this personal tie, like as we're getting into the park, what as a kid coming here was your like overall impression of the Treme? What do you remember strongest?
Let me tell you, it was so different. One of my favorite things about coming here as a kid, my grandma took us everywhere first off, because she always wanted to know about our different family, and also more importantly, where all us Creoles come from, New Orleans. Biggest memory I have, music. Going to people's backyards and just listening to jazz. Just going to somebody's house, an uncle, an auntie, could be a cousin, and just hearing them play jazz in their backyard. That's a tradition that's been going on for years and years and years, even in the early 1900s. Like, that's how old that tradition is, and it's something that's still kind of done to this day. My family back in Bayou Sierra, we still do that to this day. We just randomly come together in a yard, in a space, everybody bring their instruments, we sing, we play, we jazz.
And as we're gonna see, outdoor music is like the history in this space. And we just passed through the gate, and like being by the marching band monument here, worth pointing out, like the connection with Louis Armstrong, obviously the music connection is strong. And he's in some ways a really appropriate mascot for this space, just because, like, I mean, single most famous New Orleanian of any kind, specifically a musician, and that is, as we've mentioned, some of what really matters in this space, and certainly an example of like New Orleans Black excellence, but not the signature kind of person who would be from this neighborhood in the 1800s, which would go more into the word Creole that you're using. So when we talk about Creoles of color or free people of color, like what all does that associate with for you?
For me, it's different because y'all gotta understand something. A lot of this history, which is the reason why we're doing this, a lot of it is unwritten. So as a Creole person, that word to me means someone who's part of the culture, born and raised in the culture, whether you know the language or not. You know the different foods, you know where the foods come from, the ties to West Africa, but also your French side as well. You know how it got combined with the African stuff to create this pot of gumbo that they like to call us Creole. And there's different meanings of Creole. At one point, it meant that your parents came from the old world and had gave birth to you in the new world. That made you Creole to that location. Eventually, that changed to just people mixed with African blood, and they were Creole. Then it became a whole African, French, cultural, big just thing. It just became a big, huge culture, which involved food, music, dancing, clothing, which we still wear to this day. And for me, Creole just means that gumbo mix.
Yeah.
That big old mix of music, religion even, culture. For me, the food, like y'all know we put our foot in y'all food. And for those Southerners who ain't watching this right now, all that means the food is good for real, not for play. You can hear that a lot. That is a Southern expression. But we pride ourselves in our Creole food. Y'all come on down here and get y'all something to eat.
We'll show you where. Mention the unwritten part of the history. In the written part of the history where you do see those terms used, so Creole was ambiguously, originally would have meant, like you said, the folks mostly in the French Quarter at first who were going to be French and Spanish descended but lived over here, and then you get Creoles of color, which kind of rolls into being Creole as well. And then that term free people of color, I think a lot of folks associate people of color with being like a very modern PC term, and in fact, like you find that term in like 18th century legal records.
Y'all, we still use that term today because you can't just call somebody black nowadays. We mix with all kind of stuff. So it's the safest thing you can say, to be honest with you, is a person of color. And that applies all across the board. And that involves Creole people, no matter how dark or how light they are.
And here in the Treme, so for example, someone who grew up here in the 19th century who identified themselves as Creole or free person of color might have called someone like Louis Armstrong black as a way of distinguishing themselves from each other, because so many of the people here were mixed. Their families had been free for a long time. They did not have last names like Armstrong. They spoke French. They were Catholic versus Protestant, all these different things. And so you had real deep divides within that community, even between different people with different levels of mixture, like what the time would have called mulattoes versus quadroons versus octoroons, all these ways of splitting people up.
I think it's safe to say now to just think of the word Creole as a way to say come together. Because there's just a whole bunch of mix of just people just coming together, and we just eating and dancing and drinking and having a good time. So Creole just means to come together, honestly now. Like the definition keeps changing through time. One of my favorite things about being a Creole person is that I'm able to do these things like this and like show y'all the truth behind this stuff, because there's a lot to see. And honestly, I don't think we're gonna have enough time to even cover it in this video.
This is gonna be far from comprehensive, y'all. I mean, the Treme contains so much that we're inevitably gonna be leaving some things out. So like, if you've got an experience with a personal connection with the Treme, light or heavy, whatever it is, like, please, comments are a great place to chime in on the story, because we are not enough, we're far from enough to cover all of this.
We do read the comments. We want to see y'all responses. It's okay.
You know, let us know what else you wanna see too. I know, Robi, for you, you've told me that like Louis Armstrong was one of the people who was held up for you as like a family story growing up.
He was a big old family story for us, just to make sure that we had our tie to New Orleans when we was kids. My grandmother used to tell us stories about how he wasn't accepted in a bunch of white spaces that he was allowed to perform in, how he kind of paved the way for a person of color from Louisiana just to go into places that no person of color has ever been. Music, big deal, because he was a black person traveling across the United States and the world even, playing music, our music. It was ours. So he was a big fixture in our folklore and our just regular stories. His name crossed our lips all the time. And you think about this, like a name Armstrong. A lot of people always want they think a Creole name has to be French or whatever.
Sidney Bechet, something like that.
Something like that. And some people will tell you, yeah, Louis Armstrong was Creole because he was from New Orleans. Or some people say, no, he wasn't Creole, he was black. We don't care, to be honest with y'all. The man was a big, major, like, I didn't have a lot of heroes personally growing up. he was one of them for me. Louis Armstrong was one of my biggest heroes from the stories I used to hear from my family and also more specifically my grandmother.
In terms of going back to the root connection with all this stuff, we can get on over into Congo Square. And
yeah.
I would love to hear, so y'all who have watched the Voodoo Tour, you'll have seen this already. If you want to learn more about it than we're going to do today, the Voodoo Tour is a great one to watch. It's a great one to watch one way or another. But Robi, can you tell us just kind of from this performance-y perspective, a little bit of the basics of how Congo Square came to be and what it's all about?
Woo! That's a history right there, baby. Congo Square was where a lot of the enslaved and ex-enslaved and also free people of color who are of African descent, they're allowed to come out here to Congo Square and keep a lot of their culture alive. A lot of the drumming that still happens to this day, every Sunday in Congo Square. Some of my family, some of my extended family still come out here and drum for the ancestors to this day. Also, those rhythms also are the foundation of jazz, those rhythms that you hear in the drumming. So this open area is still used to this day by my family, other people's families, with those same rhythms that were created back then, now, which still points to jazz, which gave birth to blues and other forms of music. This is so significant to me. My family still comes out here and pray. We've been praying out here for generations, since they were enslaved, my family. So Congo Square, man, first it was Native American territory. Of course, that was taken away from them. Then the West African slaves came out here. Every Sunday they had off, so they were allowed to hop the wall that used to be there and come out here and keep their culture. See their children that were sold to other families in the French Quarter. See some of their family that actually earned their freedom, but they were still not allowed to see because they were enslaved. They were all out here in Congo Square, checking on each other, feeding each other, keeping their cultures alive, something we still do to this day. Very important mural here, which depicts like an artist's, this is an artist's rendition of what might been, like what you might have seen back in the 1700s and the 1800s when the West African slaves came out here. There's a lot of significance here, but more importantly, look at the drumming, look at the dancing. And I love pointing this out. I did this on the Voodoo Tour video. I'm about to do it again. Look at that woman dead in the center. Remember, women are dominant in this culture. Y'all need to understand that. That's important. They ain't got nothing to do with voodoo, just so y'all know. But even to this day, we still we elevate our women.
Y'all, worth mentioning, so as important as it is and as clear as it is today that this is a culturally African neighborhood and really like maybe the most important neighborhood in Black history in the US, arguably, the commemoration of it as such, having things like this monument here, that's a pretty recent phenomenon. So 2010 is when we have that go in. A lot of other monuments are just in the last decade or so.
Mm-hmm. Sorry.
What's up, hey?
We're gonna cut it out.
Oh, I know you too.
Nice to see you.
Videos.
What?
Yes.
I do.
Well, you get to watch
We
this
get to
one
watch-
soon?
Stop.
Might see yourself. We're doing that now.
Yours.
Well, this is French Quarter and thereabouts always feels more real when you have the people you recognize. We all cross paths a lot.
That's like family.
We've been missing
Everybody
that.
family around here.
So it's worth, I think, y'all having a little bit of a historical picture for how this came to look the way it does, because it's been through really, really different phases. So going back all the way to the beginning, when New Orleans is founded in 1718, this is outside the city limits. Rampart Street over there had a wall and a fort right about where we started. And then as you go on, you get, as we discussed, the Congo Square space where gatherings could happen. And that was a little public common along the edge of the Treme plantation, as it eventually came to be named. And that was the property of a man named Claude Treme, and the neighborhood gets named after him in 1810 when he sells it to the city. And so streets get laid through it, people start to live out here, and the preponderance of people who do live out here are gonna be your free people of color, although a real solid mix. It's a white-black mixed neighborhood all around. So you've got a lot of mix then, and it really gets to be heavily people who are moving here from other places, especially from Haiti. Because right during this time, really big in New Orleans history, the Haitian Revolution sends a lot of folks across the water over to here. Free, enslaved, white, black, mixed. You get all these cultural traditions. So when we talk about somewhere like Congo Square, it's not just African and American, it's also Caribbean that plays into all of that.
Haiti, qui Jean est là.
We're going to talk Creole language, y'all, but there's 2 Creole languages in this brain, at least.
There's
Maybe
2.
more.
Might be more.
Maybe more developing right now from the mixture of them.
Yeah. I get them mixed up all the time.
Sure, I'm sure people can pick out the differences and just get some fun accent out of it. As time is rolling on here, y'all, so you get this gradual growth of the neighborhood throughout the 19th century. And then as you get close to the Civil War, the tradition of the gatherings in Congo Square temporarily dies out, probably because of the Civil War, though the history is a little obscure. And then in the late 19th century, it's really kind of actively covered up that this was what it was. In the 1890s, the city names Congo Square Beauregard Square and plants most of the trees that you see out there. So even that appearance that it has today somewhat dates from that time. And then as you get into the early 20th century, there's actually a playground and pool only for white patrons on that site. So it is invisible as far as the African element that lived there so powerfully just a few decades before. In the 1920s, you get this idea of building a big theater out here, which becomes the Municipal Auditorium. It's this big, imposing presence in the park. It ends up being a performance space for all kinds of different genres. There's jazz performances, there's big orchestra concerts, there's wrestling matches, like everything happens in that space for a long time. Mardi Gras balls. And originally that theater was supposed to be built on top of Congo Square as we know it now, but that would have wiped out the pool and the playground. So it ended up being put a little further back where it is today, covering part of what used to be Congo Square. And then you have mid-century, the neighborhood shifting from being this very mixed neighborhood to being a mostly black neighborhood because of white flight going on after World War II. And then the park finally starts to come to be following that. So getting into the 60s, there's this idea that we're trying to boost tourism. The city builds a lot of its big hotels at that time. The idea is for a big performance complex in the vein of like Lincoln Center, but it ends up having to level a huge amount of this neighborhood to the enormous protest of the people who live here at the time. That gets, ignored. And ultimately, many blocks of the Treme, residential blocks and old music venues, are torn down. And the whole planned complex never really takes shape except for one theater that opens up in the early 70s, and which is today called the Mahalia Jackson Auditorium, but doesn't even have that name at the time. So still kind of a covering up and actually a reduction of African-derived stuff here for a good long while. And when the park finally comes to be, it's after Louis Armstrong's death. When that first project is petered out, the city decides honoring Louis Armstrong, where he came from, makes sense. And so little by little, finally finishing off in 1980, you end up getting this park somewhat as it is. It hosts the first Jazz Fest in 1970 on the way towards the park being built. So there are pieces of really important music history in there, but the commemoration really comes late. And so when we talk about all the destruction that the creation of this park entailed, it really complicates the place in the eyes of the people who live here. And it's rare that you see any exceptions to it. There's one right over here, which is a little complex of buildings that was saved by preservationists at their request because it does have a really close connection with music history. So this is an old Masonic lodge hall called Perseverance Lodge Number 4. And while this was a white Masonic group, they rented the space out to all kinds of groups, and you ended up having a lot of early jazz performances happen here. But groups like Masonic lodges, when you look at like what caused social cohesion in this neighborhood, there were families, there were churches, and then there were these mutual aid societies. After slavery came to an end, when the people who were formerly enslaved didn't get a lot of help to make their new life start, this was the stuff that held people together, was you joined a mutual aid society, you paid dues, those dues paid back if you got sick, or when someone died, it paid for the burial. And that's where our jazz funeral tradition comes in, because these groups had a social calendar, they played bands all the time, and then once it was time for a funeral, you wanted to have the band come out and show that this person was part of something big and great and that you wanted to be a part of in turn. So, a place like this, we have all that history there, but today it's just sitting empty. So neglect is a pretty big part of the theme in this neighborhood. After oftentimes, change is inevitable, of course, but when change has happened here, especially coming from government, it has tended to be a place where the changes are destruction for the benefit of somebody else. Y'all can see we are now outside of a fence, so the park is kind of closed off from the Treme itself. It's very welcoming from the side that faces the French Quarter, big open gates, but on these sides, it's a little bit more forbidding. It suggests that this is a thing for visitors and not so much for the people who live out here. And as a last note about those buildings over there, guys, one of the things that did go on there for a long time that's worth you knowing about is our radio station, WWOZ. It broadcast out of there from its creation up until Hurricane Katrina from the kitchen building for that whole complex. Anytime you need a New Orleans soundtrack, that is your station. And you can also find, when music is going on, a full list of live music events on that station's website as well. And maybe the folks most likely to be familiar with WWOZ are the people who watched that show Treme that we mentioned. One of their main characters is a DJ on WWOZ, DJ Davis, and they actually start off his story in the show with a mention of the studio moving from Armstrong Park, where they originally were, to the French Market, where they still are today. So while you only see that French Market studio in the show, you actually get a mention of Armstrong Park at that point from the very beginning of the first season. So, did you have a sense, Robi, of coming up about the park and how people in the neighborhood felt about it?
Oh, Lord, they hated the fence.
Yeah.
I can tell you that there. Because they, a lot of people who from the Treme, including my family, there's a sense of family pride. And this is theirs. This belonged to them. Like, they feel like this is theirs. Most of the people were people of color, they got kicked out the French Quarter after a certain amount of time. They wasn't welcome there because of racism. They landed here. A lot of those descendants still run around here, and they taught, just like I was, that this is yours. This belongs to you. So you done built a fence where we didn't grow up at to stop us from going up in there to dance, to sing, to feed the homeless. That's a big one right there, because you fed your community. To pray, to keep all these traditions alive that they want us to die. They want this stuff to die. And here we are in the Treme still keeping it alive to this day.
I know for us, so like, you and I have both for a long time been giving in-person tours inside the park that would then move on into the French Quarter. So for us, being out here now means we are on a Treme tour.
Right.
Like, this was the only one that and y'all, if you visit New Orleans and come see us, Treme tours are something we do regularly, although it's something slightly fewer people ask for, so they're a little less regular. But it's the one that gets outside the park and actually goes into the neighborhood. And y'all, of course, this company has been operating as an in-person tour company way, way longer than we've been doing the video thing, and we still do. We've both been working with the company for a few years, and when you see the free in the name, what that means, free tours by foot, is that the tours we do are all pay what you will. So you have the option to take a tour either for free up front or for, depending on some of them, a kind of minimal registration fee. And then at the end, you pay whatever you feel like it was worth. And you and I have both been making our living that way for a few years now.
Yeah, it's been about 4 or 5 years now. Worth it.
Yeah, and also, like, we treat the videos that way too. We invite anybody who finds these inspiring or informative. If you feel like tipping your guide, you'll find Robi's information down below in the description. And thank you, seriously, so much to those of y'all who have done that already. It's pretty fantastic.
Thank you. So important to us, especially with everything that's going on. But we just love that y'all love these videos so much.
Yeah.
Like, that's the most exciting thing for me. So thank all of you and continue to let us know what y'all want to see. That's important too.
Take your shirt off.
Thanks, James.
And of course, a like and a subscribe are very helpful ways to do it too. Liking helps other people find it. Subscribe helps you find us again. Y'all, as we make our way over towards the church and the Backstreet Museum, we're passing by an intersection of two streets named Henriette Delille and Ursulines, and these are both named after nuns. Ursuline's named for the Ursuline Convent, which is located in the French Quarter on this street, and then Henriette Delille is a specific nun. She was a 19th century woman who, born into this class of free people of color, she didn't have a lot of options in terms of what a woman could do outside of either marrying or being this kind of arranged mistress, this everything but marriage relationship with a white man. But she wanted to become a nun, and she ended up creating the first order of nuns that accepted women with African ancestry. And it becomes the Sisters of the Holy Family, which still exist. And they operated schools, which tons of people living in the Treme went to school with the Sisters of the Holy Family. You also have a benefactor of hers, this guy, Tommy Lafont, who was, similarly to her, mixed race, guy who could probably pass for white in his time, but lived in this very visible middle class. And he was a wealthy philanthropist in the end who supported that and school integration and a lot of stuff that was like cutting edge for early 19th century. So those are just a couple of examples of what the lives of Creoles of color, free people of color might look like. These folks were like professional musicians and poets and craftsmen and artisans of all different kinds, and sometimes had, you know, international renown, even if they're not huge names today necessarily. And speaking of the Catholic Church, here we are at St. Augustine. This is the fixture of the neighborhood. Was this a spot you ever spent time?
No, I never spent time here at the Catholic Church. We were so voodoo, we never.
Slash Baptist.
Yeah, slash Baptist, also slash Catholic to the cousins and the aunties and uncles that was here though. But like when I came down, that Baptist side of my family never wanted us to go to Catholic Mass. And then one time I did go to Catholic Mass, I got tired. And you know, in Black Baptist churches, you know, it's all about the. And Catholic Mass it's
the token time when you just sit and listen and you don't do a whole lot else.
And I just remember just being the one time I went, I was like, I'll never do this again. And I remember interacting with one of my cousins who was like big in the Catholic Church. She's from the Treme. And we had just got back from a second line because one of my friends, daddy passed away. And I remember coming back, and I just came in the house I was ready. I was still feeling the music coming in from dancing in the street. And she was standing there looking at me, and she said, "Y'all still do that stuff?"
Oh, wow.
And I wasn't mad at her. I wasn't, because, you know, to each his own, like I said.
Everyone needs someone to condescend to.
Yes, and that's exactly what was happening. Now, bless her little heart, she realized that was her culture too.
Sure.
She just had left it behind.
That's right.
I can't blame them. That was a survival tactic for a lot of people of color back then. There's a level of respect for that. This is an example of that right here. Sitting right now in the middle of the Treme is a Catholic church. There's more than one Catholic church, but around the corner, you'll find a Baptist church right around the corner. Ain't nobody fighting each other. Ain't nobody hating each other. Everybody respects each other's wishes. And there's that word again, Creole, all together.
And this, there's deep history here too. I mean, the Catholic Church goes further back here than the Baptist Church does. Yeah. This place, built by the same architect who did St. Louis Cathedral as we see it now. So, you know, as far as historical structures go, super important. And two, so when this was built, it was at the request of free people of color who lived in the neighborhood who wanted their own church. And you end up getting white parishioners coming in once the pews are for sale. And it used to be you paid pew fees. So the pews were something of a status marker. There were 4 rows of pews in here. And what happened was the free people of color population in the neighborhood bought up 3 of them. The white population ended up with 1 row. And 2 of the rows that the free people of color had gotten went to enslaved people. So this very, very specific piece of civil rights progress, but this was the first church, at least in New Orleans, and maybe anywhere in the US, where enslaved people got to sit down. Very specific, but kind of a big deal for its place and time.
For those of you who know your plantation history all across the South, for an enslaved person to sit down in the presence of someone who's of non-color is a big deal. You know, that happened here in the Treme, and so it's a big deal that happened in the Treme neighborhood.
We talked about jazz funerals before and these processions that have an African origin but took on their own special forms here, and we've mentioned second lines a couple of times. So as we build towards getting into the religion, it feels like a good time to hit up the subject of second lines and all that via our museum across the street.
The Backstreet Culture Museum is a big one for me because even though I wasn't born here, I'm born in Louisiana, yeah, but not born in the city of New Orleans, grew up here, I had never been to the Backstreet Culture Museum until Andrew took me. And a lot of family elements, a lot of cultural things that I'm like, oh, that's why we do this. That's why we do that. That's why a lot of black people like myself still do this. Right here in the Treme, a second line tradition originated, it wasn't called a second line tradition, but it originated in West Africa. And the idea is that whenever you die, we have either God, depending on your tribe, or an ancestor spirit will safely guide your loved one's spirit to their next resting place. In order for that spirit to be pleased to do so, you had to take the whole family who lost a family member, and in the village, all the family members would line up, and this is done by age. So you have the oldest members of the family in the front, and you have the youngest in the back, and they would walk through the village mourning the death of whatever family member passed away. Once they got to the area where they buried their dead, depending on the tribe, of course, they put them in the ground and did whatever ceremony was done per tribe. But on the way back, this is done all across the board. You celebrated their life. That's when all the crazy dances came out. That's when the rhythm picked up. That's when nobody was crying no more, because now you're celebrating the fact that the spirit has helped that person's soul transition to the next place safely.
And these traditions we're talking about that the museum features are a really big part of that show Treme from HBO. You see second lines, you see jazz funerals, and one of the main characters is a Mardi Gras Indian, the other tradition that this museum really centers on. And you get both the pageantry of those processions and also some of the nuts and bolts of how they work. So there's a whole plot line about one of the second line groups getting a permit, which was really difficult after Katrina. And you see the museum itself in some of their episodes as well.
Y'all, we got into so many different stories and subjects during this tour that we actually had to cut a lot of material out. So if you'd like to see more, we're gonna have some additional video from the Treme tour on our Facebook page and Instagram TV.
In that respect, in terms of like all that stuff we've talked about with the stuff that's unseen, the stuff that isn't recorded, the unknown pieces of history, we've got a great monument for that right over here on the side of St. Augustine Church, which is the Tomb of the Unknown Slave. So we're gonna pay that a visit.
Definitely gonna pay that a visit.
We've had a lot of to-do around monuments in New Orleans the last few years, but I think what I've never heard anybody dispute is that there's not a lot devoted to the African extracted side of our city's history, and that there always could stand to be more. So this one gets specifically into, it points at a thing where, you know, usually when you see monuments, it's about someone we know a lot about. It's about heroes, individuals who somebody sees as a hero, or just significant historical figures. The achievement here is that it really, it highlights how much unknown there is when we talk about slavery, that many people died enslaved without their name ever having been written down in a way that lasts or that represents them as anything other than an asset. It's like a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in that way, where we know that war can be so violent that it like severs the connection between a person's body and their name, and slavery was that same kind of force. I know, like, so we've been talking about the stuff that's missing from the historical record, and also specifically that there are these multiple religions in the neighborhood. So I feel like I want to connect the dots for people that, like, when you go to plantations, you see the plantation church, you know, you have the baptismal records, you have the Bible, which was that was read to the slaves on Sundays. Like, what we know about enslaved people does not include what was in their hearts. And in the case of religion, it's pretty well understood that, like, that connection, in the case of enslaved people, it's pretty clear that, like, religiously, there was a lot more going on than is written down.
Oh, yeah. I tell y'all, there's a lot of history about slavery in the traditions and stuff that's just not written down. Some of y'all already know, like, technically I don't exist. According to the Historical Society and records, Louisiana Creole died out a long time ago. And guess what? It didn't. So there's an example of things just not being written down. A lot of these West African slaves, including my ancestors and my family to this day, if you ask them what their religion is, they'll tell you flat out they're Catholic. People come to the house, what's your religion? Oh, we Catholic, we pray to the Lord. And as soon as that person leaves, as soon as they step out that door, they may look at each other and go, Kisadila, which means, what did she just say? And go straight to that altar and light up that white candle for their ancestors. That's something we still do to this day.
And the survival of it is testament that it was there before.
It was there before.
It hasn't been reinvented. From the music subject we've been talking about too, y'all, there's a Creole element to that. So Creole music would be these songs that developed in rural Louisiana that had like a French and Spanish dance element and West African rhythms at the same time. And it's fusions like that that lead up to jazz, which is itself a fusion. You could say the two main ingredients of jazz are going to be your ragtime, which is piano dance music where the harmony is pretty European traditional, but then you get West African beats in there, and then blues, which is probably a synthesis of West African and British folk music. And jazz ends up becoming the base of a whole lot more. Like, music education is a big part of this neighborhood's history. You had this incredible school that we went pretty near, just outside of the park, called the Joseph Craig School. Today it's a charter school. But a lot of people went there. You've got Doreen Ketchens is like the best known street musician, probably, this incredible jazz clarinetist who plays in the French Quarter all the time and started in jazz because she wanted to get out of a pop quiz, so she signed up for band. And then there's this guy, Earl Palmer, who went there, who, like, we've said that this place is the foundation of like why local music sounds the way it does. And Earl Palmer, after going to that school, becomes a jazz drummer, but he also plays in the earliest rock and roll band. So he records with Fats Domino, who does his very first studio recordings in 1949, right across the street from the Treme at the edge of the French Quarter. And those things sell massively, and they're really the beginning of rock and roll. So he's a guy coming from this second line tradition, and he puts the kinds of rhythms you'd hear in that, and that you would have heard all the way back into Congo Square, into these rock and roll recordings. We're right now by the Treme Petite Jazz Museum. This place is a great, I mean, there's a jazz museum in the French Quarter, which is excellent in its way. It's a little bit more, it doesn't tell the overall story as much. You're getting a little bit of local history, you're getting specific exhibits that rotate. This one goes through the whole thing, and the founders here really, really know their stuff, and they're the ones usually giving you the walkthrough. So you got this, you got the African American Museum on the next block, which is going to get into the local history from a bit more of a zoomed out lens, and that's built into some traditional Treme and French Quarter architecture as well. So you get to see one of those old houses from the inside.
Yeah.
Within the past year, we had the bad news of the restaurant that we're by right now. So this is a real institution called Lil Dizzy's, part of this series of restaurants owned by the Baquet family. We got the bad news that during the COVID-19 shutdown, they decided to put this place up for sale because they couldn't keep it open anymore. So ultimately, good news came around that another generation of the family is going to pick it up and do it. So thank goodness this one's still around. Willie Mae's Scotch House, one of the other big institutions, is hanging on. We've got Dookie Chase also hanging on.
Still in there.
All of those are still there. So far, the Treme, in terms of restaurant survival, doing okay, but just not very many here to that point.
Not very many. And speaking of Treme and food and stuff like that, let me throw y'all a little tidbit of information that all y'all need to know. Let me ask y'all a question. What do you call gumbo that ain't got no okra up in it? You call it soup. That's what you call it. You call it soup. Because it ain't gumbo unless it got the okra up in there. Ain't no kale, ain't no carrots. It's called soup. Ain't no okra in there, it's called soup. Because gumbo means okra.
Like literally, the word, I don't say literally often, but this is what it's for.
Okra. In Louisiana Creole, the word for like the actual plant, for the it's called gumbo.
Yeah, so I can attest to the generous okra in the gumbo here.
This place got this is Robi's opinion. This is just Robi, because you know how y'all, if you don't know me, y'all know I love to eat. And I like good tasting food. And let me tell you, this place got some of the best gumbo in the whole entire city of New Orleans. For real, not for play. Ça c'est bon en pile.
And y'all too, I mean, so we haven't addressed the TV show Treme much so far, but like if you watch Treme, the first season, one of the main characters is a lawyer who is hounding the police to get some information out of them. And this is the place where she has meetings non-stop. So like you see this restaurant in that show, and besides putting culinary culture on display, like it was about that show drew attention to a lot of things at a time when, of course, like attention was a real dear currency in New Orleans post-Katrina. The musicians who they hired to be on that show to play themselves a lot of the time, like a Hollywood gig pays way better than a bar gig in New Orleans.
Oh,
so
yeah.
It kept those people afloat by employing them. So if you watch that show, you're gonna see, a Hollywood version of New Orleans storylines, but one that took a lot of care to fold real New Orleans into it to a point where it can be a bit confusing. Power through the first season, and you'll get a lot of treasures of local New Orleans culture. and great music all throughout. So that show, one of the locations where you'd see regularly once you watch it.
Y'all go get y'all flavorful food and hear some flavorful music.
Yeah, support this place when you come back. It was a near-death experience, but it worked out. We got one more thing to see, y'all. So mentioned that there was a little bit of an overpass project over here. So same time as the whole big development of Armstrong Park was going on, or rather the de-development, the destruction of those blocks, we had the same thing going on over here where you can see this wide treed street that we're walking down, Esplanade Avenue. There was an even wider, much more treed one just ahead of where we're going on North Claiborne Avenue. It was so wide that you had, at one point, a canal down it. You had children playing sports in the middle of it. This is outside of our lifetimes, but it's like something, people who remember this neighborhood from their youth, mid-century, it's a fixture. And this really was like, it was like for us, Magazine Street or St. Charles or any of this other big, often very commercial gathering places and tons of businesses along here. But when the interstate highway system was developed, which in large part was for the purpose of facilitating fast travel from place to place and commuting from the suburbs. Once the suburbs were built, the whole kind of white flight enclaves, this facilitates people getting into and out of them, and it is built right over the kind of pinnacle of black business success in the area. So this really crushes a lot of people's hard work over decades and decades. And of course, on its own, it's pretty oppressive. But it gets turned around to be this other thing. Like the street was a gathering point already, and so it is given even more of that function after the fact, where like Mardi Gras Day, you come down here and you hang out under this bridge right at the intersection with Orleans Avenue, and everything is happening under this bridge.
From food to dancing to drinking to partying to kids learning how to dance, culture exchange, it all happened right here.
You talk to Mardi Gras Indians and they actually kind of like it because it resonates. They play their drums and you get this reverb underneath it. It's like you're amplified, like you're giving a concert. So it's not ideal, but it's been adapted in a creative way to be okay. And I feel like that, if there's one kind of sum up thing about the whole Treme, it's not ideal, but they've made it okay. It tends to be the story here, where like you go from anti-slavery activism at one point to like after the Civil War, you go into Homer Plessy and all of the integration efforts to get equal access to resources. You go on into the mid-century when this happens, and the civil rights movement is ignoring this because it's concentrated on other things like voting. And you get into the present day, where there are more and more stories like this still unfurling, and like it makes you think, like my takeaway thinking about all of it is like, what an incredible supply of energy and will people all through here have, and what could be done with all of that if it wasn't people fighting just for like essential recognition as human beings the whole time.
Perseverance is an important word as far as this is concerned, because this was built due to racism. It was built to actually just destroy black people being successful. We persevered and we're still successful. You put up a highway, we're gonna make it ours. That's what we did.
I don't know that I can say anything to that, but amen.
Ashe.
Well, y'all, we've mentioned some other tours and some other subjects during this. And so if you want to get to know the voodoo subject more, like we said, Robi's got his video out there. We go much more into the nuts and bolts of the music history with our music history video, so check that out as well. I'll see you over in that one. And food being a really important subject here. We've got one of those coming up, so maybe by the time you see this, that's going to be available. So again, remember, you got down in the description the means to drop your appreciation to Robi. Go look for that. Please do the like and comment and subscribe thing. All of that helps us, people find us, and so we can get your input, their input, the world's input on what we should be doing going forward. Thank you all so much for watching.
Thank you.
Come see us soon.